Welcome to the National Museum of the Pacific War, located in Fredericksburg, Texas. I'm Reagan Grau, Director of Collections and Exhibits. Perhaps you're wondering what a Pacific War museum is doing in the Texas Hill Country. Fredericksburg is the birthplace of Fleet Admiral Nimitz. He commanded the Pacific Fleet in World War II. This museum was originally opened in 1967. Today we're examining some artifacts we have on display and a few in our archives related to the Doolittle Raid, the 80th anniversary of which was on Monday the 18th. I'll share with you some of the stories that came to us related to those artifacts. Before we get started, let's watch this short video we have in our Doolittle Exhibit, which gives a brief history of how the Doolittle Raid came about. And then we'll get into some of those artifacts.
After Pearl Harbor, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted to strike back hard at the Japanese. The plan was to bomb Japanese cities, especially Tokyo, but the U.S. had no airfields close to Japan. Traditional naval planes would have to be launched from aircraft carriers dangerously near Japan. The ingenious solution was to launch longer-range Army Air Force B-25 bombers from those same carriers, even though it had never been tried before. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle would plan and lead the attack. Doolittle's strategy was to bomb 5 Japanese cities and then land in friendly territory in China. On the day of the attack, the carrier Hornet carrying Doolittle's planes was drawing closer to Japan. But Japanese patrol boats spotted the Hornet 700 miles from Japan. Doolittle decided to launch immediately, even though they were 150 miles further away than planned. Doolittle's plane was first in line for takeoff. When they reached Tokyo and the other cities, the B-25s flew low over their targets and dropped their bombs. Low on fuel and headed for China, some pilots had to parachute into Japanese territory. Some were captured and held prisoner. 2 pilots were executed. Other B-25 pilots crash-landed or parachuted into Japanese-held areas of China. Chinese soldiers helped rescue some of them. Doolittle's raid didn't cause much physical damage to Japan, but the psychological damage was great. For centuries, the Japanese believed that they were invulnerable to attack. Now they knew that America planned to bring this war right to Japan's doorstep. Doolittle was awarded the Medal of Honor for his courage.
I'm located in the George H.W. Bush Gallery, and behind me is a B-25. This is a B-25J model, a later model than the ones used during the Doolittle Raid. The Doolittle Raiders flew B models of the B-25. And this one is depicted on the deck of the Hornet. If you see the mural behind the plane, you'll see 15 other B-25s painted on the deck. You'll notice the roundel is the early version of the identifier that the Americans used with the red circle inside the star. That was discarded shortly after the war started because it looked a little too similar to the Japanese roundel, which was the rising sun. And so the Army Air Forces decided to get rid of the red circle, so it was just the white star on the blue field. This airplane came to the museum in the 1990s from Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock. When that base closed, this was one of the planes out front that greeted visitors to the Air Force base there. And when the base closed, the Air Force loaned this aircraft to us for display purposes. Now, the back turret, the rear turret, has got painted broom handles in it rather than gun barrels, because the Doolittle Raiders had to launch a little earlier than anticipated. And so in order to conserve fuel for the longer flight, they had to lighten the load a little, so they discarded some of the weight, but anticipating resistance once they got over mainland Japan, they wanted to at least give the Japanese pilots that responded something to think about if they approached in an airplane to attack. Each of the 16 airplanes on the Doolittle Raid carried 5 crew. Next to the bomber, we have an exhibit case that's full of items from the Doolittle Raid. The first item we see is a flight jacket worn by Howard Sessler. He was the navigator and bombardier aboard plane number 15. Up top is a newspaper article celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the Doolittle Raid. So this was published during the war and came out April 21st, 1943. Waldo Bither carried that .45 caliber pistol during the Doolittle Raid. Waldo Bither also carried this compass during the raid, and he donated that pistol and the compass to the museum in the mid-1970s. He was one of the very first donors to give the museum artifacts from the Pacific War. The combat knife was carried by David Pohl on plane number 8, and he was a gunner aboard that plane during the raid. We also have an ashtray made aboard USS Hornet and given to Edward York, the pilot of plane number 8. Behind it is a log kept by a sailor aboard the Hornet who witnessed the airplanes take off one by one, and he recorded on the log the minute each plane took off. For example, bomber number 4, perfect takeoff, 8:35. Bomber number 5, perfect takeoff, 8:37. Bomber number 6, perfect takeoff, 8:40. So he was watching it minute by minute as the airplanes took off from the deck of the Hornet. Now that we've seen what's on display in the gallery, let's head upstairs and see what's being preserved in the archives. We're now on the second floor of the George H.W. Bush Gallery, where the artifact collection is housed and preserved. We've got a few items related to the Doolittle Raid to examine while we're here. Come with me. Here we have the Congressional Gold Medal awarded to the Doolittle Raiders by Congress. Congress issues these for distinguished achievement. This one was minted and awarded in 2014 and presented to Richard Cole, who has signed this one. Now, the obverse here depicts the first plane taking off from the deck of the Hornet, which Doolittle piloted, and Cole was his co-pilot. They were first to take off, and the 16 stars on the perimeter here represent one of each of the bombers. Now, the reverse side features the Doolittle Raider motto, "Ever into Danger." It's got the insignia of the 4 bomb squadrons that made up the bomb group that performed the Doolittle Raid, and it's got the date that Congress presented the medal, minted the medal, and gave to the Raiders in 2014. Richard Cole lived about 25 miles down the road from the museum in Comfort, Texas, and he'd pay us a visit every once in a while and tell stories and participate in programs, and he was the last surviving Doolittle Raider. He passed away in April of 2019. have 3 leather jackets donated by Doolittle Raiders in the collection. I've got this one donated by David Pohl. He was in crew number 8, and they were the ones that elected to divert to the USSR and land there instead of China. And they were subsequently interned for a year or so before escaping through Iran back to the Allied fold. I've also got a jacket that belonged to Waldo Bither and another one that belonged to Richard Knobloch. Waldo Bither was in crew 12. Knobloch was in co-pilot of crew 13. And these are typical leather flight jackets that were issued early in the war. These jackets are probably 80 years old. We're very appreciative of the opportunity to preserve our nation's history here in the Archives and Collections Department of the National Museum of the Pacific War. I hope you enjoyed getting to see some artifacts and hearing their stories connected to the Doolittle Raid. We'll now go to some questions from our audience. Before we get started with any questions, there is one more item that I would very much like to share with the audience. I've got a copy of Carol Glein's book written about the Doolittle Raiders called Doolittle's Tokyo Raiders. And this is a first edition that's in our library here in the archive. It's in the rare book collection, actually, because this particular volume has been signed by nearly 24 Doolittle Raiders. And if you look carefully, you'll see I've got Doolittle's signature here. I've got Richard Cole's signature. And this one's also signed by the author. This was donated to us in 2014 in an intimate ceremony in the museum's ballroom in the old hotel. Richard Cole was present for this event as well. I can't remember exactly who donated this to us, but it came 7 or 8 years ago, and it is also a valuable addition to our collection. Now, it looks like the questions have begun to roll in, and Christopher is asking, can you give more details about the Japanese medals attached to the bombs? There is a story attached to the Doolittle Raid where prior to takeoff, when some of the bombs were being armed or organized to be loaded into the bombers, some of the raiders had taken aboard with them some medals that were given by the Japanese government to Americans to commemorate friendship or something like that. And coming on the heels of the Pearl Harbor attack a few months after, we see the Doolittle Raid here. Gestures of friendship maybe rang a little hollow in April of 1942. So some of these medals were wired to the bombs, and the Doolittle Raiders returned some of the medals to the senders. Let's see. I have another question here about, are there any B-25B models still around? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sure there are a few other Doolittle Raider exhibits in other museums around the country, and maybe one of those features a B model. But I do know that all of the aircraft from the Doolittle Raid, none of them survived. They were, they crashed in China, and one crew elected to land in Russia, and so I'm sure the Soviets reverse engineered that plane to its parts. Another question, Howard would like to know, where did the crews do their short takeoff training on land? There was a base in Florida, Eglin Airfield in Florida was where the Doolittle Raiders did their training, and they were trained by a Navy carrier aviator, and he was the guy that that taught them how best to handle carrier takeoffs. And there were a few models, airplanes, bombers considered for the Doolittle Raid, but the 25 was settled upon because one of the other models' wingspan was too long. The other one's controls were maybe not quite right. And so the B-25 was determined to be the best for this particular mission. But getting back aboard a carrier was out of the question in an Army bomber. So the plan was to just land in friendly China. Let's see, Mark would like to know, are the Doolittle Silver Cups still at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio? Now, some of the lore that's attached to the Doolittle Raid are these silver goblets that represented each of the 80 Raiders. And as the Raiders aged and began to pass away, the display of these goblets was the goblet associated with any particular Raider would be removed, turned upside down, and placed back into the case, indicating that this particular Raider had passed away. And as far, I'm not real sure exactly where the goblets are these days. It could very well be in Dayton, Ohio, still. Maybe maybe they travel around. I think I've heard of them being at the Air Force Academy at one point in time, even. Let's see. William would like to know which crew members took the longest to make it to friendly forces, other than those that gave their lives during the and soon after the bomb run. Okay, I think that's of those pilots and crew that were not captured and interned in Japan, there was one crew that I should begin by saying that everybody who didn't perish or was captured was eventually repatriated back to American forces. And so the crew that took the longest was the crew that, because they were low on fuel after completing the bombing raid over Japan, they elected to land in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was not at war with Japan at the time. So landing in the Soviet Union was a bit controversial because the Russians didn't really want to provoke the Japanese into attacking them. And they wanted to preserve that neutrality because the Russians at this time had their hands full with Nazi Germany. So the crew that landed in the Soviet Union, they were, of course, interned according to international law. Surely about a year after their internment, they were basically encouraged to escape, and they were shuffled around Russia for a while, and they eventually ended up very close to Iran and were allowed to escape, if you will, into Iran. And there the Allies occupied Iran during the war, and so this crew was able to make contact with a British consulate or something like that, and they were able to get back into the Allied fold. Now, a lot of the Raiders, went on to serve elsewhere. Many served in the China-Burma-India theater. Others, I think, Doolittle ended up serving in Europe along with Cole and some of these other guys. I think we've got another question here. What other aircraft are at the National Museum of the Pacific War? Let's see. We have 5 in our collection. We saw the B-25 that's on loan to us from the Air Force. Also in our collection is an F-4 Wildcat on loan to us from the Navy. And that one is, that one would be like one that would have been an early war model. So it's featured in our Guadalcanal exhibit, and it helps us tell the story of the Cactus Air Force. We've also got a TBM Avenger, very similar to the one that President George H.W. Bush flew when he served in the Pacific, we've got one of those. We also have a Japanese Val dive bomber, what's left of it, because it was attacked on the ground and a bomb went off underneath it in New Britain. And the wreck was recovered and delivered to the museum in the early 70s. And it helps us depict the cost of war. And we have a fifth airplane on loan to us, I think from the Air Force. And it's a very rare Japanese Rex float plane. And it's a fighter that can take off and land on water because it's got those pontoon float attached to its underneath its fuselage and two out on the outboard wings. And that one's pretty rare. Here's another question. Why have the planes not taken off from Enterprise as well as Hornet? Well, the Hornet was in port in Alameda in California, and the Enterprise was at sea. And these two ships rendezvoused in order to carry out the mission. They rendezvoused out at sea, so there was no other deck for the 16 bombers to be loaded upon. And one of the side stories from the Doolittle Raid is the crew of the Hornet, of course, were not informed about what they were doing. They just witnessed these 16 Army bombers being placed on the decks of their carrier. And so I'm sure the rumor mill got cranked up and they began to assume probably that they were just delivering these airplanes to some base in Hawaii, and why couldn't the airplanes fly themselves there? And so the air crew in the first few days at sea were treated, maybe less than ideally from the crew, until it was announced aboard the Hornet that no, we're not going to Hawaii. We're not delivering these planes to some field. We're going to attack Tokyo. And so the mood of the crew toward the Raiders all of a sudden changed. And now these guys, we have a lot of oral histories in our collection here that attest to this, that these sailors all of a sudden began to treat the Doolittle Raiders with a lot more friendlier, and began to treat them with some of the perks of living on a carrier, I guess, some of the treats and special things to eat. Here's another question from Michael. He asks, I have read that the Japanese killed large numbers of Chinese for protecting the Doolittle Raiders. That, unfortunately, is true. When Japan, of course, lots of China was occupied at the time by the Japanese military, and it was understood in Japan that these aircraft ended up attempting to fly to friendly fields in China. And so the Japanese army at the time had no compunction about reprisals. And so I think there is estimated that up to 250,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers were killed for assisting the Raiders in escaping from China and getting back to the Allied fold. So yes, there were some serious reprisals inside China, or occupied China. See, John would like to know, how were the planes loaded onto the carrier? By crane. There was a large Navy installation there at Alameda in the San Francisco Bay. And so the airplanes were able to land, and they were able to taxi over to where they were picked up by the gantry crane, and loaded onto the carrier decks and then spotted accordingly. See, Manny would like to know, who originally initiated the idea to bomb Japan? FDR, President Roosevelt, wanted to strike back, and I believe it was, and I'm not sure the officer's name, but I think it was a Navy officer who suggested that we put B-25s, or we put bombers aboard carrier decks in an attempt to sail close enough. And then, Halsey and Doolittle met secretly in January or February and began to formulate a plan to honor FDR's wishes to strike back at Japan. Let's see. Here's a question from Ruth Ange. Did the B-25 at the museum see action during World War II? I do not know. I don't know if J models made it into the war or if they came a little later after the war. I'm not real sure. Okay. JP would like to know if any of the planes were hit by flak or other weapons. The Doolittle Raiders did experience some anti-aircraft resistance, and I believe the Japanese did put some airplanes into the air, but none of the Raiders were shot down. Let's see. Howard would like to know, what were the 5 crew positions? Okay. We had pilot, co-pilot. We had a nose gunner. We had a navigator, bombardier, and we had maybe like a waist gunner. I think it was another gunner kind of in the back of the plane. Of course, there were no guns in the rear turret, but I believe there was some on the sides. Ron, having Cole visit your museum must have been exciting. Well, he did live 25 miles away, and he did enjoy some celebrity, and he was generous with his time. He would come to the museum, maybe on a raid anniversary or something like that, and he would allow himself to be interviewed by local media or even media out of Austin in front of the bomber that we just saw. And he was usually very generous with his time and never seemed to mind interacting with the public and museum visitors. So I think that having Cole so close by just lended a lot of made the museum experience for those that got to visit with him. It just made it a lot better. Okay, this will be the last question from Kenneth. Did the Raiders have any navigation equipment except compass? That lots of superfluous equipment was removed from these bombers. And if there was navigation equipment that was deemed unnecessary, I imagine it was removed. I do know that the bomb sights were taken out and replaced by something that was so simple in nature that one of the Raiders devised a contraption that cost me 20 cents to produce. So the sophisticated bomb sights were removed from each bomber, and then this other bomb sight that was contrived by one of the Raiders was installed, and they referred to it as the Mark Twain. We certainly do thank you for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed the presentation, and we would sure appreciate your feedback on a survey that's going to be delivered at the end of this. So we appreciate y'all's time today. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see y'all again the next time we host a webinar.